Matariki is the Māori name for the star cluster Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters. Matariki is also the name for an international network of 7 universities that are distinguished by their historic traditions and unique approach to facing contemporary challenges. The Matariki Lecture Series offers a short program of lectures addressing current research themes or areas of common interest.
This time, the lecture series is on race, racism, and decolonisation, with a specific focus on decolonisation.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and just really want to acknowledge everyone who is joining in the global community today. Really appreciate holding the space for all of us here. So Jo and I are presenting Decolonising Psychology, in particular looking at the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project. So first of all, I want to acknowledge and pay respects to traditional custodians of the land that we meet on, elders past, present and emerging. We also wish to acknowledge and respect the continuing culture, strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as well as Indigenous peoples across the world. Thanks, Jo. So just to position ourselves and locate ourselves, this is the beautiful Australian country, and this map shows all the different First Nations, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people across Australia. We are in the southwest of Western Australia, and you can see in the blue here, that little snippet there. I'm calling in from my home country, which is Bibbulmun Wadundee Territory. Jo's calling in from the Whadjuk Nation, where they're all little clan groups amongst the nation of the Noongar people.
Great, thank you so much, Belle. So just a bit of a rundown of the agenda. We'll first start by giving a bit of history of the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project, or AIPEP for short. Then we'll talk a little bit about the outcomes of the first AIPEP, and Belle will run you through the current psychology workforce, a bit of a lay of the land of where we're at. And we'll talk to the revitalisation of AIPEP, AIPEP 2, through the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing project. And we'll talk a bit about the community of practice that's been built through AIPEP 2. So just to give you a little bit of history about AIPEP. So the discipline of psychology historically has been developed from that very Western Eurocentric lens, and this has often excluded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews and conceptions of health and wellbeing. So before AIPEP, there was little to no Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content in psychology higher education, but any content that was delivered was often delivered from that very colonial deficit-focused standpoint. And the outcomes of this impacted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in that they felt that the content wasn't relevant, or it was very difficult to translate into their own cultural contexts. And the outcomes of this also impacted non-Indigenous students too, in that they lacked cultural responsiveness and knowledge when they were graduating from their psychology degrees. So AIPEP was funded in response to that underrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in psychology, and also the lack of cultural responsiveness that we were seeing in psychology education. And AIPEP was led by Professor Pat Dudgeon. So just a little bit of a rundown of some of the first aims of AIPEP 1 and the outcomes. So one of the aims was to increase Indigenous knowledge and content in undergraduate and postgraduate psychology training. And so a curriculum framework was developed, which really speaks to the different strategies and the different types of content that psychology education providers can embed in their curriculum, right from first year psychology all the way to postgraduate psychology. There was also a focus around the recruitment and retention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychology students, and there was a framework and guidelines around strategies for increasing student support. there as well. There was also another focus around professional development and competencies in psychology, in the psychology workforce. And so a workforce capabilities framework was developed just to provide some information around what are the core sorts of knowledges that the current workforce need to know about to work effectively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the mental health space, and to do it in a culturally responsive and safe way. So one of the big outcomes, though, of the first AIPEP was that there was national backing from a number of psychology accrediting bodies. And one of those was the Australian Psychology Accreditation Council, which is a big body in Australia that accredits psychology courses. And so in 2019, they actually changed their standards and included a cultural responsiveness standard that requires all universities to embed cultural responsiveness as a core competency in psychology higher education. And this was a really amazing outcome of the first AIPEP.
Yeah, absolutely. So following that, I just want to give a little bit of context of the psychology workforce. So the profession, or the discipline of psychology, and the profession of psychology, represents a large body of the workforce in Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia represent about 3.5% of the population. Yet we have very, very few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychologists in the profession. So there's an estimate that we need over 1,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychologists to reach that parity. Also, there is significant underrepresentation of Indigenous and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in psychology, studying psychology in university settings. So there's this really great recognition that we're really needing to build this workforce. So not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychologists in the discipline and profession, but really supporting students to successfully come through their university years. Thanks, Jo. Very briefly, I'm going to touch on this. So the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing project is a grant that has 3 different streams. And the AIPEP project that Jo introduced has been revitalised under this grant. And this is really, really important, and with all the national backing from the peak bodies. So under the, you can see it in blue, the Empowering Workforce stream of this really important grant. The AIPEP 2, what we're calling the AIPEP 2 project, has now been revitalised. And what's really important is this is coming from not only strong backing from various bodies, but this is very strong Indigenous leadership. We have very, very strong Indigenous governance in this grant, and it's making really important headway. Thanks,
Belle. So just a little bit of a rundown then of the second iteration of AIPEP, AIPEP 2. So we've been working in partnership with higher education providers to implement the findings from that first iteration of AIPEP through a number of different mechanisms and ways. One of those is building a community of practice with higher education providers to really build that support and capacity to actually make the curriculum transformations and to decolonise their psychology curricula. So we've had 29 universities nationwide sign up, and that's more than 70% of all universities across Australia, which is just an amazing outcome. And there's a really, there is the push from the accreditation standards, but there's actually a really genuine interest to decolonise psychology, and it's just been a really great group. And Belle will explain a little bit more on that soon. So another stream of work is a scoping and evaluation of psychology education. So we're really wanting to just see where universities are at in terms of decolonising their curricula. What have they been able to achieve? What are they finding difficult? And maybe sort of working out what we can do to assist them to overcome these barriers. And we're also really wanting to understand how they've been able to support their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students as well in that process. We're also working with key executive stakeholders in the AIPEP 2 Executive Stakeholder Advisory Group, and we have a number of national representation. So we have the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association on board, APAC, as I mentioned before, the Australian Psychological Society, the Psychology Board of Australia, and the heads of schools all involved in that project, which is incredible. So just a little bit more on the community of practice. So the community of practice consists of representatives from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bodies, as I mentioned, AIPEP before, and this helps to ensure strong Indigenous governance over the entire project. We also have the 29 higher education providers, as I mentioned, and this is comprised of heads of schools, undergraduate and postgraduate coordinators, senior lecturers, course conveners, so all of the really top sort of people in terms of actually making those curriculum transformations, and that's really important. And we also have backing and representation from the Australian Psychological Society and HOTSPA, which is the Heads of Schools Association there as well. So our community of practice meetings are held once a month via Zoom, and they're facilitated by Professor Pat Dudgeon. So I'll just pass you on to Belle, who will describe a little bit more about the community of practice meetings.
Yeah, so in these meetings, a real kind of collaborative sharing of knowledges, of experiences, and that coming together in relationship and reciprocity to really critically reflect and look at ways to decolonise psychology curriculum and increase Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation. So there is, discussions around, what is the meaning of decolonisation, discussion around recruitment intention, graduation, support, opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. People will present on pilots and best practice examples, things that they're trying or is in process or they've had successes with. Also, as part of this community practice, Joe and I, as well as Professor Pat Dudgeon, we've been organising webinars with the Australian Psychological Society on trauma-informed care, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, decolonising practices. The AIPEP website is a really wonderful website for information and resources that people in the community practice can draw on to embed some of these knowledges in their curriculum. We've also been providing one-on-one support to higher education providers when there's been requests. And an example of that is with the University of Western Australia, the School for Psychological Science. Joe, as well as other team members, been leading what we call a yarning circle with faculty members within that faculty to look at how they're decolonising their curriculum, how they're embedding Indigenous knowledges into their curriculum. This is just a quick show of the AIPA website. And you can see on there, some of the clearinghouse examples of the resources that we provide, that we update all the time. People in our community of practice share resources, as well as we source them as well. So I'm just going to move my tile because I can't actually see on here. Okay, so so we also have our social media pages with Twitter. So you can see the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing Twitter. I also just want to mention the Centre for Best Practice in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention. That's one of our sister grants that we're very, very closely linked with as well, and has just a world of amazing information around, cultural resiliency and decolonising practices as well. These are all of our community partners across the nation, with a lot of really, really important bodies, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander governed bodies that we're in partnership with across our grant. This is our really broad team. And over on the left, we have a very strong matriarchal leadership with Professor Pat Dudgeon, Professor Jill Milroy, and Professor Helen Milroy. And that brings us to the end. And thank you so much for sharing space and hearing about our presentation.